Hello and welcome to another episode of Our Story, 250 Years of the United States of America. This daily show recounts the most important events from American history going year by year across 250 episodes in preparation for our 250th anniversary on July 4th of 2026. If this is the first time you are hearing this show, welcome aboard, and if you're returning, welcome back. Now let's get into the episode. With initial peace talks having taken place near the end of last year, Americans can breathe a little easier. The British have evacuated the southern cities of Savannah and Charleston without incident, and soon will be gone for good. Loyalists are beginning to feel increasingly persecuted in this country whose culture has dramatically shifted within the last 20 years. A new nation barrels towards fulfilling its potential, and debates begin about the details of the new self-governing system. Our two main stories today are the Newburgh Conspiracy and the Treaty of Paris, but there's much more to cover. Welcome to 1783 in America. It's New Year's Day in the United States of America, and the Continental Army is still camped out at Newburgh, New York, along the Hudson River. It's bitterly cold, and morale is low because Congress has not paid these men as they have promised. Many soldiers have gone months without wages, and Washington, sensing a mutiny may be imminent, spends the winter trying to keep the army together. The reason for these officers' displeasure stems from the soldiers believing that their service in the eyes of the government and civilians will go underappreciated. The soldiers' long-term absence from civilian life means they will need to readjust and adapt to a home that has become accustomed to their absence. Without a pension from the Confederation Congress, many soldiers and officers will be left penniless and jobless. In Congress, the debate over whether to pay the Continental Army is heated. Due to the Articles of Confederation, Congress does not have the power to tax, but the states do. Moreover, Congress is responsible for maintaining a standing army and is currently some $6 million in debt. Congress also cannot draft soldiers, and they cannot regulate trade. Some members of the Confederation Congress support the funding of the Continental Army, such as Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and Robert Morris. Those in favor of funding the Continental Army call a meeting with the group of senior officers who had delivered the memorandum at the end of last year. By January 6th, a congressional committee is created to address the officers and the memorandum. Committee members argue for a lump sum of funds rather than the half pay for lifetime payments. Committee meetings are fruitless, however. Secrecy plagues the committee members and opposition grows. For now, the looming idea of peace and ultimate victory in this revolution outweighs the Continental Army's needs. On the 23rd, Congress ratifies the two treaties signed with the United Netherlands last October. With America now recognized as a free and sovereign nation by the Dutch, the treaties establish peaceful relations and trade agreements that are beneficial to the shaky economy. Britain unofficially recognizes the United States' independence on February 3rd, and the next day formally declares that it will cease hostilities with the United States of America, though Spain refuses to grant diplomatic recognition to the United States. Spain, like Britain, holds a vast colonial empire, and the Spanish government fears that the example of American independence could inspire similar uprisings in their own Latin American territories. Additionally, they worry about the potential growth of the United States encroaching on Spanish Florida and their western land claims. I tried to explain it a few ways, but describing states that share the same names as they do now but with different borders is likely going to be confusing in an audio format, so if you want a better understanding of how the borders are currently drawn, Check out the 1783 treaty map on our X at 250 years of USA. The important thing to note, however, for at least the purposes of this show, is that the United States ends at the Great Lakes in the north, the Mississippi in the west, and much of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains is hotly contested with various Indian tribes. Everything west of the Mississippi is currently owned by Spain, as well as the southern coast and Florida. On February 8th, a plot begins. Colonel John Brooks returns to Newburgh with 2 letters. One from Alexander McDougall and Matthias Ogden is addressed to the entire army about the poor situation in Philadelphia. 4 days later, another letter from McDougall, signed under the pseudonym Brutus, explains that Knox may be required to start a mutiny and refuse to demobilize until they are rightfully paid. The following day, rumors of peace between Great Britain and the new nation begin to spread, and Alexander Hamilton soon writes to George Washington, urging him to support the Continental Army's plight. Washington, however, sympathizes with both the Continental Army and Congress, explaining to Hamilton, "To me, it is clearly my opinion, unless Congress have powers competent to all general purposes, that the distresses we have encountered, the expenses we have incurred, and the blood we have spilt in the course of an 8 years' war will avail us nothing." On February 21st, Henry Knox replies to McDougall and Morris in a letter that explains the Continental Army is a sharp point which will never be directed other than against the enemies of the liberties of America. On March 5th, the last official commemoration of Massacre Day in Boston, Massachusetts takes place. The first time this solemn anniversary was observed was in 71, commemorating the Boston Massacre that played a part in furthering the growth of revolutionary sentiment. But now, Independence Day, celebrated on the 4th of July, commemorates the brave actions that the founders took to shake off the injustices of British rule, and is a day for joy and festivities, while also carrying the weight of sacrifices made by American patriots to fight for an independence they never got to see realized. Unfortunately, this year, many Continentals are reaching a breaking point. Since the success at Yorktown, Britain has been backing away from further military actions and peace is on the horizon. With this promise of an end to the conflict, the states have been even more reluctant to fulfill Congress requisitions for the Army, and the Articles of Confederation give Congress no power to implement attacks. Many men are underpaid, if paid at all. In early March, at the Northern Army's camp in Newburgh, Major John Armstrong circulates an address that further stokes discontent among the 700 men and their leaders. The address implores the men to abandon the moderate tone of Washington's petitions to Congress in favor of a forceful ultimatum. If Congress does not comply, the Army should threaten to either disband, leaving the country unprotected, or refuse to disband after a peace treaty ending the war is signed, the latter being a thinly veiled threat of a military coup. On March 10th, a meeting of officers is anonymously called for the following day, but Washington is made aware of the scheduled meeting and aims to address the issue by reinforcing the need to follow protocol and observe the chain of command. The general orders given on the morning of the 11th address this plan, saying, "The Commander-in-Chief, having heard that a general meeting of the officers of the Army was proposed to be held this day at the new building in an anonymous paper which was circulated yesterday by some unknown person, conceives, although he is fully persuaded that the good sense of the officers would induce them to pay very little attention to such an irregular invitation, his duty, as well as the reputation and true interest of the Army, requires his disprobation of such disorderly proceedings. At the same time, he requests that general and field officers, with one officer from each company and a proper representation of the staff of the Army, will assemble at 12 o'clock on Saturday next at the new building to hear the report of the Committee of the Army to Congress. After mature deliberation, They will devise what further measures ought to be adopted as most rational and best calculated to attain the just and important object in view. The senior officer in rank present will be pleased to preside and report the result of the deliberations to the Commander-in-Chief. By the inclusion of that last sentence, it's widely understood Washington will not be present. And on Saturday, March 15th, the officers gather, and General Horatio Gates steps forward to chair the proceedings. However, he is interrupted as George Washington enters the room unexpectedly through a side door and asks for permission to address those gathered at the meeting. Gates, unable to refuse, yields, and Washington begins speaking to the officers, urging their continued loyalty. Now, I have scoured the internet for a good reading of the address, but haven't found any besides an audiobook that I wasn't too happy with the sound of, so I went ahead and recorded the address myself. It's about a 10-minute reading, but worth it, though I can only hope to do justice to Washington's words. Gentlemen, by an anonymous summons, an attempt has been made to convene you together. How inconsistent with the rules of propriety, how unmilitary, and how subversive of all order and discipline. Let the good sense of the army decide. In the moment of this summons, another anonymous production was sent into circulation, addressed more to the feelings and passions than to the reason and judgment of the army. The author of this piece is entitled to much credit for the goodness of his pen, and I could wish he had as much credit for the rectitude of his heart, for, as men see through different optics, and are induced by the reflecting faculties of the mind to use different means to attain the same end, the author of the address should have had more charity than to mark for suspicion the man who should recommend moderation and longer forbearance, or, in other words, who should not think as he thinks and act as he advises. But he had another plan in view, in which candor and liberality of sentiment, regard to justice, and love of country have no part, and he was right to insinuate the darkest suspicion, to effect the blackest designs. That the address is drawn with great art and is designed to answer the most insidious purposes, that it is calculated to impress the mind with the idea of premeditated injustice in the sovereign power of the United States, and rouse all those resentments which must unavoidably flow from such a belief that the secret mover of this scheme, whoever he may be, intended to take advantage of the passions, while they were warned by the recollection of past distresses, without giving time for cool, deliberative thinking, and that composure of mind which is so necessary to give dignity and stability to measures, is rendered too obvious by the mode of conducting the business to need other proof than a reference to the proceeding. Thus, gentlemen, I have thought it incumbent on me to observe to you, to show upon what principles I opposed the irregular and hasty meeting which was proposed to have been held on Tuesday last, and not because I wanted a disposition to give you every opportunity consistent with your own honor, and the dignity of the army to make known your grievances. If my conduct heretofore has not convinced you that I have been a faithful friend to the army, my declaration of it at this time would be equally unavailing and improper. But as I was among the first who embarked in the cause of our common country, as I have never left your side one moment but when called from you on public duty, as I have been the constant companion and witness of your distress, and not among the last to feel and acknowledge your merits, as I have ever considered my own military reputation as inseparably connected with that of the army, as my heart has ever expanded with joy when I have heard its praises, and my indignation has arisen when the mouth of detraction has been opened against it, it can scarcely be supposed at this late stage of the war that I am indifferent to its interests. But how are they to be promoted? The way is plain, says the anonymous addresser. If war continues, remove into the unsettled country. There establish yourselves and leave an ungrateful country to defend itself. But who are they to defend? Our wives, our children, our farms, and other property which we leave behind us, or in this state of hostile separation are we to take the two first, the latter cannot be removed, to perish in a wilderness with hunger, cold, and nakedness? If peace takes place, never sheath your sword, says he, until you have obtained full and ample justice. This dreadful alternative of either deserting our country in the extremest hour of her distress, or turning our army against it, which is the apparent object unless Congress can be compelled into an instant compliance, has something so shocking in it that humanity revolts at the idea. My God, what can this writer have in view by recommending such measures? Can he be a friend to the army? Can he be a friend to this country? Rather, is he not an insidious foe? Some emissary, perhaps from New York, plotting the ruin of both by sowing the seeds of discord and separation between the civil and military powers of the continent? And what a compliment does he pay to our understandings when he recommends measures in either alternative impractical in their nature? But here, gentlemen, I will drop the curtain, because it would be as imprudent in me to assign my reasons for this opinion as it would be insulting to your conception to suppose you stood in need of them. A moment's reflection will convince every dispassionate mind of the physical impossibility of carrying either proposal into execution. There might, gentlemen, be an impropriety in my taking notice, in this address to you, of an anonymous production, but the manner in which that performance has been introduced to the army, the effect it was intended to have, together with some other circumstances, will amply justify my observations on the tendency of that writing. With respect to the advice given by the author, to suspect the man who shall recommend moderate measures and longer forbearance, I spurn it, as every man who regards that liberty and reveres that justice for which we contend undoubtedly must. For if men are to be precluded from offering their sentiments on a matter which may involve the most serious and alarming consequences that can invite the consideration of mankind, reason is of no use to us. The freedom of speech may be taken away, and dumb and silent we may be led like sheep to the slaughter. I cannot, in justice to my own belief, and what I have great reason to conceive is the intention of Congress, conclude this address without giving it as my decided opinion that honorable body entertain exalted sentiments of the services of the army, and from a full conviction of its merits and sufferings will do it complete justice, that their endeavors to discover and establish funds for this purpose have been unwearied and will not cease till they have succeeded. I have not a doubt, but like all other large bodies where there is a variety of different interests to reconcile, their deliberations are slow. Why then should we distrust them? And, in consequence of that distrust, adopt measures which may cast a shade over that glory which has been so justly acquired, and tarnish the reputation of an army which is celebrated through all Europe for its fortitude and patriotism? And for what is this done? To bring the object we seek for nearer? No! Most certainly, in my opinion, it will cast it at a greater distance. For myself, and I take no merit in giving the assurance, being induced to it from principles of gratitude, veracity, and justice, a grateful sense of the confidence you have ever placed in me, a recollection of the cheerful assistance and prompt obedience I have experienced from you under every vicissitude of fortune, and the sincere affection I feel for an army I have so long had the honor to command will oblige me to declare in this public and solemn manner that in the attainment of complete justice for all your toils and dangers, and in the gratification of every wish so far as may be done consistently with the great duty I owe my country and those powers we are bound to respect, you may freely command my services to the utmost of my abilities. While I give you these assurances, and pledge myself in the most unequivocal manner to exert whatever ability I am possessed of in your favor, let me entreat you, gentlemen, on your part, not to take any measures which, viewed in the calm light of reason, will lessen the dignity and sully the glory you have hitherto maintained. Let me request you to rely on the plighted faith of your country, and place a full confidence in the purity of the intentions of Congress, that previous to your dissolution as an army they will cause all your acts to be fairly liquidated, as directed in their resolutions which were published to you 2 days ago, and that they will adopt the most effectual measures in their power to render ample justice to you for your faithful and meritorious service. And let me conjure you, in the name of our common country, as you value your own sacred honor, as you respect the rights of humanity, and as you regard the military and national character of America, to express your utmost horror and detestation of the man who wishes under any specious pretenses to overturn the liberties of our country, and who wickedly attempts to open the floodgates of civil discord and deluge our rising empire in blood. By thus determining and thus acting, you will pursue the plain and direct road to the attainment of your wishes. You will defeat the insidious designs of our enemies, who are compelled to resort from open force to secret artifice. You will give one more distinguished proof of unexampled patriotism and patient virtue, rising superior to the pressure of the most complicated sufferings, and you will, by the dignity of your conduct, afford occasion for posterity to say, when speaking of the glorious example you have exhibited to mankind, had this day been wanting, the world had never seen the last stage of perfection to which human nature is capable of attaining. At the conclusion of these remarks, he reaches into his coat pocket to produce a letter, and with it pulls out his spectacles. Some of the officers in the room have served alongside Washington since '75, yet nobody has ever seen him wear eyeglasses. He looks up at the crowd filling the small room as he prepares to read the letter from Joseph Jones, and says some variation of the following line: "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." Many soldiers are reportedly deeply moved by this expression, and if his logical and impassioned address has not already, the moment no doubt causes them to reconsider their grievances, seeing that even their trusted and respected leader has made sacrifices in the course of this war, and encourages them to refocus on the higher ideal of what it was that they were fighting for. The Army's concerns are, for now, unaddressed, but through his careful handling of this volatile situation, encouraging the men to work with, not against, the government and Congress, Washington is able to keep the Army together through the end of this war. Throughout history, many revolutions end in a military coup, and revolutionary leaders often then consolidate dictatorial power under the new status quo. While it can't be said for sure how all the many variables could have interacted with each other had Washington not calmly and graciously diffused the situation, an American military mutiny in the 11th hour of the revolution would have undoubtedly changed history for the worse and caused countless tragedies in the young United States. Thomas Jefferson later expresses the significance of Washington's mediation, saying that the moderation and virtue of a single character had probably prevented this revolution from being swiftly closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish. In a letter to the Continental Congress on March 18th, Washington writes to assure the body that the unrest of officers is over, saying, "The result of the proceedings of the Grand Convention of the officers, which I have the honor of enclosing to your Excellency for the inspection of Congress, will, I flatter myself, be considered as the last glorious proof of patriotism which could have been given by men who aspired to the distinction of a patriot army, and will not only confirm their claim to the justice, but will increase their title to the gratitude of their country." Explaining his decision to address the soldiers in Newburgh to Alexander Hamilton, Washington writes more frankly, "I was obliged to rescue them from plunging themselves into a gulf of civil horror from which there might be no receding." By way of this year's other main story, on April 15th, the preliminary Articles of Peace are ratified by Congress, formalizing a ceasefire, while the actual treaty is still being finalized. 3 days later, Congress proposes a revenue system that includes a national 5% tariff on all foreign imports and recommends that each state's taxation be based on its population, including enslaved people at a rate of 3/5 of a person. The wording of the 1783 resolution states, "Direct taxes shall be apportioned on the basis of the whole number of free inhabitants, including those bound to service for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description." This is the first official federal expression of the 3/5 formula and sparks heated debates among delegates. Though the plan is adopted by Congress, it never gains the unanimous ratification by the states required under the Articles, and it does not take effect. Though the idea of a 3/5 compromise and the debate over its fairness will resurface, this being its earliest iteration. It's now May, and in Newburgh, New York, at the Continental's Army headquarters, the Army is largely idle, awaiting word of a final peace treaty, and as evidenced by the aborted mutiny in March, is facing growing discontent over unpaid wages and the disbanding process, though not all feel resentment in their commissions. On the 13th, a group of Continental Army officers led by Major General Henry Knox meets and formally establishes the Society of the Cincinnati, a fraternal and hereditary order for Revolutionary War officers. Knox writes the charter, which states its goals as commemorating the achievement of American independence, preserving the union of states that resulted, and maintaining the bonds of friendship forged in war. George Washington is elected the Society's first President General, and he accepts the role before the summer is over. With the war coming to an end and patriots retaking Loyalist strongholds, tens of thousands face persecution, confiscation of property, and expulsion from their communities. Last year, British Commander Sir Guy Carleton received orders to prepare for the evacuation of Loyalists, and now is putting the plans into motion. Over 3,000 Loyalists comprise the first wave of migration, many being settler families from southern colonies or black Loyalists promised freedom for their allegiance. Loyalists begin leaving American cities in large numbers, especially New York City, which has been the primary safe haven for Loyalists fleeing the Patriot-controlled states. We haven't checked in on the city much, but the 7 years of war have taken a nasty toll. The city has been operating under martial law, providing little protection for civilian lives and property, and the British military's rampant corruption made it an exceedingly dangerous place to be. The streets are covered in filth with no sanitation collection. Most schools have been closed and churches were converted into hospitals, prisons, barracks, or storehouses. Nearly every tree in the city has been cut down to make firewood, and as that ran out, they turned to burning wooden fences. Later in the episode, we'll head back to New York, but throughout the summer, ships begin ferrying the evacuating Loyalists in greater and greater numbers to various parts of the British Empire, especially Nova Scotia, as it's the closest major British settlement to New York City. Despite Washington's diplomatic handling of the grievances expressed by the army camped at Newburgh in March, the underlying issue of soldiers going unpaid has not been resolved. On June 17th at the Philadelphia Barracks, soldiers formally protest to the Pennsylvania Executive Council by sending a petition demanding their overdue pay and threatening to take matters into their own hands if ignored. The petition states that they expect a final settlement of their accounts and the payment of the money due them, or they will take measures to do themselves justice. The Pennsylvania Executive Council, led by John Dickinson, receives the complaint but offers no immediate resolution, citing concern about the legality of the troops' demands and discouraging any extra-legal action. Word spreads that the Pennsylvania line is protesting, and about 100 additional soldiers from the Army's barracks in Lancaster march to join them. Their numbers now totaling about 300. The garrison's commander, Major John Christie, later describes the atmosphere as discontented, sullen, and ripe for mischief, as the combined group prepares a more visible demonstration. On the morning of June 21st, the armed and uniformed soldiers march to the State House, where the Congress of the Confederation is in session. According to congressional journals, the mutinous soldiers placed guards at the doors with drawn bayonets, and the members of Congress were kept as virtual prisoners for several hours. The soldiers do not issue a formal ultimatum, but demand satisfaction for their unpaid wages. Congress is trapped inside, the implicit threat of use of force unmistakable. Congressmen regard the situation as an armed affront to national sovereignty and urge Dickinson to round up the militia to disperse the mutineers. While still trapped inside the State House, Congress passes a resolution. Resolved that the President and Supreme Executive Council of Pennsylvania be informed that the authority of the United States having been grossly insulted by the disorderly and menacing appearance of a body of armed soldiers, it is in the opinion of Congress indispensably necessary that effectual measures be immediately taken for supporting the public authority. Dickinson refuses to muster the militia, fearing the militiamen will sympathize with the soldiers and only compound the problem. He instead opts to negotiate with the mutineers. By the next day, the soldiers have left, but Congress has no guarantees of protection and passes another resolution deciding to evacuate the city, adjourning for 3 days and reconvening Thursday in Princeton, New Jersey. On the same day, Alexander Hamilton writes to Washington from Philadelphia, saying, "Yesterday, the mutiny of a part of the Pennsylvania troops took place. The troops came to the place where Congress were sitting and insulted them by surrounding the State House with fixed bayonets," and goes on to plead for Washington to send a senior officer to restore order. Washington, still headquartered in Newburgh, is deeply concerned by Hamilton's letter when he reads it on the 24th. He orders 3 full regiments of infantry and even a detachment of artillery, about 1,500 men, to march toward Philadelphia. He assigns Major General Robert Howe to command the expedition. In his response to Congress, he notes that many of the soldiers mutinying at Philadelphia have had it comparatively easy, not having to face the cold and not being involved in any major battles, compared to the maimed and wounded men that have served through violent campaigns, brutal winters, and starvation, yet still remain loyal. While Washington's detachment is preparing to march, the mutiny in Philadelphia fizzles out on its own. By the 25th of June, Pennsylvania authorities begin investigating the incident and persuading the troops to stand down. There are no known reports of violence, casualties, or physical arrests during the mutiny, and Washington's detachment never enters Philadelphia. Eventually, the Pennsylvania Council arrests several of the sergeants who led the demonstration and disbands the units involved. The mutiny has lasting effects, however, as Congress won't return to Philadelphia as its regular seat for years. Instead, they now meet at Nassau Hall at the College of New Jersey, known to us as Princeton. September 3rd brings with it the payoff of the years of brutal conflict that has been ravaging America. In the most important moment since the signing of the Declaration, 3 men representing the new United States are seated at a table in Paris on a clear autumn day. John Adams of Massachusetts, who has spent years advocating American independence abroad, John Jay of New York, former president of the Continental Congress and a fierce defender of American sovereignty, and Benjamin Franklin of Pennsylvania, who has lived in Paris for nearly a decade cultivating critical French support for the war. British Representative David Hartley arrives to sign on behalf of King George. He is well-liked and respected by all 3 American negotiators. A liberal Whig and longtime friend of Benjamin Franklin, Hartley has opposed the war from the beginning, publicly advocating in Parliament for peace negotiations. A sense of mutual respect tempers the bitterness of a war that cost tens of thousands of young lives. Franklin, Adams, and Jay sign the treaty under the Great Seal of the United States, which is affixed to the document with red wax. Hartley signs opposite them, placing the final British signature on the document. In this simple act, 8 years of war ends with the stroke of a pen. Britain has grown tired of the war, and Americans have proved they won't easily be subjugated. The terms are highly favorable to America, and it's often said these concessions are made in order to prevent any future desire on America's part to seek more favorable terms through later conflict should the terms eventually be seen as too oppressive. Britain recognizes the independence of the United States in full and without exception. American borders are defined stretching from the Atlantic to the Mississippi River and from Canada to the northern boundary of Florida. Fishing rights off Newfoundland are secured for American fishermen, and creditors on both sides are assured the right to collect debts. Additionally, Congress agrees to recommend that states restore property to loyalists. The treaty does not secure any protections for enslaved people or address the status of those who have fled to British lines, and completely omits any mention of American Indians. After the treaty is signed and sealed, the American delegates begin arranging for dispatches to be sent to Congress. To pop down just a little bit of a rabbit hole, the most iconic depiction of this moment is a painting by Benjamin West, the official historical painter to King George III. While he isn't present for the signing of the treaty, West is close with Benjamin Franklin. He begins the painting in his London studio, intending to make a tribute to peace and diplomacy. John Adams, John Jay, Benjamin Franklin, Henry Lawrence, and William Temple Franklin all sit individually for West so he can sketch their likenesses as they pass through London after the signing. Famously, the entire right half of the painting is largely blank. The space is reserved for Hartley and the British delegation, who refuse to pose for the painting. Hartley and the other British officials are unwilling to be memorialized as having surrendered or even negotiated a peace that acknowledges American independence. For them, being depicted alongside the American commissioners in a celebratory peace painting feels too close to an admission of defeat. Today, the half-finished painting is a striking visual metaphor. Over 150 years after its completion, and I'm using that word loosely, the painting was donated to the United States and a reproduction sits above the fireplace in the Department of State's Treaty Room in Washington, D.C. Make sure you check out the painting on our X today at 250 Years of USA. On September 22nd, a congressional proclamation prohibits the settlement, purchase, or receipt of Indian lands beyond existing states without congressional authorization and instruction. This is a key moment affecting land claims beyond the states, so let's take a minute to unpack the proclamation. The goal is to regulate Western expansion and aid in managing positive relations with various Indian nations which inhabit the lands west of the states. The United States lacks the military strength and infrastructure to begin a conflict with Native American nations over this land, and it's feared that a rush of unsanctioned settlement and private land deals could provoke warfare with the native tribes and destabilize this post-war peace. They also worry that settlers will make unauthorized claims that the government can neither support or defend, and that individuals or states may negotiate their own land purchases, undercutting national sovereignty. In one of the first instances of federal power being exerted over the states, Congress centralizes control over Western expansion, ordering that only they have the authority to make land agreements with native peoples. At this time, the Kentucky counties are still part of Virginia, and the region is rapidly filling with settlers, many of whom have moved in and built homesteads without formal land titles and are relying on Virginia's land grant system. This congressional proclamation largely puts these settlers in legally uncertain positions. Congress does not recognize land purchases made directly from Native nations without its oversight, even if they were sanctioned by the state of Virginia, which creates some tension between the federal government and the state, which believes it has the right to manage its own western lands. Kentucky settlers largely ignore this proclamation, seeing it as unenforceable, and for the most part, they're correct. Enforcement is either weak or non-existent, and in the Illinois country, land claims are even more complex. This region has been claimed by the British after the French and Indian War, but as we covered in 78, was seized by George Rogers Clark on his western campaign. Under the terms of the newly signed treaty, the land is officially American, and Virginia has set up a government in the Illinois country. But the area remains sparsely populated by both French settlers and Indian nations. The proclamation undermines Virginia's claim to the Illinois country and establishes a national claim to the region. With the proclamation, the United States government makes it clear that they intend to govern the interior even if the land is not formally part of the 13 states, and will not allow a patchwork of state and private land claims. According to the proclamation, any individuals, groups, or states that wish to settle or acquire native lands must apply directly to Congress for permission and wait for formal authorization. Congress then will negotiate with native nations to approve or deny land purchases through treaties and set aside surveyed land for settlement. Following the signing of the Treaty of Paris, the Continental Army begins the process of disbandment. On November 2nd, General George Washington issues his farewell order to the armies of the United States and directs Major General Knox to deliver his farewell orders to the Continental Army in Rocky Hill. In them, he addresses the Continental Army as one patriotic band of brothers, and acknowledges that the Continental Army is the first volunteer army of citizens to fight together for freedom. He reminds them that they have now accomplished what seemed impossible for so long, saying, "The singular interpositions of Providence in our feeble condition were such as could scarcely escape the attention of the most unobserving, while the unparalleled perseverance of the armies of the United States, through almost every possible suffering and discouragement, for the space of 8 long years, was little short of a standing miracle." 2 days later, Washington issues a proclamation officially disbanding the Continental Army. Whereas the United States and Congress assembled were pleased on the 29th day of October last to pass the following resolve, in compliance therefore, I do hereby give this public notice that from and after the 15th day of this instant November, all troops within the above description shall be considered as discharged from the service of the United States, and all officers commanding corps or detachments of any such troops are hereby directed to grant them proper discharges accordingly. The disbandment is not quite instant. A small number of troops remain to maintain order and security or to care for the sick. Washington himself has one last duty to fulfill before he steps down as the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, ensuring the complete evacuation of New York City. Still, there is a great importance placed on quickly disbanding the Continentals, especially in Congress. The primary concern is a deep-seated distrust of standing armies in a time of peace. Americans largely consider standing armies a facet of tyranny, drawing on historical examples like Oliver Cromwell's use of the military to dissolve Parliament in England, and Julius Caesar's overthrow of the Roman Republic. The British use of troops to enforce the intolerable acts, such as the Boston Port Act, further reinforced this fear as colonial assemblies were dissolved and martial law was imposed. Standing armies have the potential to be used as weapons to suppress liberty, especially when controlled by a distant or unaccountable government. Reflecting this concern, the Articles of Confederation deliberately limit the central government's ability to maintain a standing army without state consent. Congress cannot raise troops directly, instead relying on state militias and requisitions, reflecting the American preference for decentralized defense. Thinkers like John Locke and Montesquieu believed that militias composed of virtuous citizens were sufficient for defense and less likely to threaten liberty, and this ideology is adopted by George Washington and others as they desire a militia-based system supplemented by a minimal regular army. On November 15th at Oxon Hill Manor in Prince George's County, Maryland, John Hanson, the first president of the Confederation Congress, dies. Few remember John Hanson, though he played a critical role in getting Maryland on board with the Articles of Confederation, thus ensuring their ratification, and in leading and organizing congressional meetings. His notice of death in the Maryland Gazette is short and reads, "This gentleman has long been a servant to his country, in a variety of employments, the last of which was that of President of Congress. Today, the site of his burial is unknown." Now let's head back to New York City, which was long considered a key to winning the Revolutionary War. It stands at a central position on the North American East Coast and offers strategic access to commerce and waterways. Just a few weeks after the signing of the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Brooklyn forced Washington to order retreat and patriots evacuated the city. We are now 7 years on from that defeat, and another evacuation has been taking place. When Carleton receives word the Treaty of Paris has been signed, he ramps up the full-scale British evacuation of nearly 30,000 British and Hessian troops and relocates an estimated 27,000 refugees to other parts of the empire. He orders the final British withdrawal by the 21st. As many cannot afford passage to Britain, British-controlled Nova Scotia is the primary destination, with more settling there than any other part of the British Empire, and its population doubles by the end of the year with 30,000 new residents. On the morning of November 25th, General George Washington and his entourage, including Governor George Clinton, approach New York City as the last British troops evacuate. The British have occupied the city since '76, and their departure well and truly marks the end of the Revolutionary War. The streets are filled with excited patriots cheering the return of their leader and the restoration of their city as the American detachment waits outside the city's northern boundary, waiting for the cannon fire which will indicate that the last of the British have left. The crowd of patriots eagerly awaits the raising of the American flag over Fort George, and as the last Union Jack is taken down, and with the American flag now waving in the wind, artillerymen begin firing the 13-gun salute, and Washington begins the final leg of the procession into Fort George to officially take possession of New York City. Washington rides next to Clinton as a sign of respect and to show his deference to civilian authority. They are also joined by General Alexander McDougall and Colonel John Lamb, both prominent members of the Sons of Liberty. They march down Queen Street and Broadway before stopping at Cape's Tavern for a brief reception. There, a citizen's address to Washington is publicly read, and it reads, "Permit us, therefore, to approach your Excellency with the dignity and sincerity of freemen, and to ensure you that we shall preserve, with our latest breath, our gratitude to your services and veneration of your character, and accept of our sincere and earnest wishes that you may long enjoy that calm domestic felicity which you have so generously sacrificed that the cries of injured liberty may never more interrupt your repose, and that your happiness may be equal to your virtues." This is Washington's first time in New York City since 1776, and the city is vastly different. Beyond the crowds and celebration, there lays a desolate city of empty lots, burned-out buildings and churches robbed of their pews to house British troops. The famous Trinity Church, which burned down in the Great Fire of '76, still lies in ruin. The work of rebuilding New York begins promptly, but it'll take quite some time and much hard work to restore the city to its previous glory. On December 4th at Fraunces Tavern in New York City, General George Washington formally bids his officers farewell, informing them that he will be resigning his commission and returning to civilian life. Although Washington had often during the war lamented the sorry state of his largely undisciplined and unhealthy troops and the ineffectiveness of most of his officer corps, the day was won, and in this small dining room in a charred New York City, he expresses genuine appreciation for his brotherhood of soldiers. The stoic Washington is described as being uniquely emotional in this moment by Colonel Benjamin Talmadge, who later writes the account of Washington's address in the tavern. The Francis Tavern Museum has produced a short video based on Talmadge's writings, which you can watch on our X at 250 Years of USA, about this tearful goodbye to his brothers in arms. On December 23rd, George Washington is in the Maryland State House in Annapolis, offering his resignation as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army to the Congress of the Confederation. His speech is highly emotional. According to James McHenry, his voice faltered and sunk. David Howell reports a most copious shedding of tears, as Washington says, "Mr. President, the great events on which my resignation depended having at length taken place, I have now the honor of offering my sincere congratulations to Congress, and of presenting myself before them to surrender into their hands the trust committed to me, and to claim the indulgence of retiring from the service of my country." Washington famously ends this address to Congress by stating, "Having now finished the work assigned me, I retire from the great theater of action, and bidding an affectionate farewell to this august body, under whose orders I have so long acted, I here offer my commission, and take my leave of all the employment of public life." He is to retire to his home at Mount Vernon, now satisfied with the total victory over the British his men fought for so long to attain. Washington's willing resignation affirms the new nation's commitment to the principle of civilian control of the military. The idea of a man in a position of so great a power willingly surrendering it informs American ideals to this day, and, ironically, bolsters Washington's public image even more. After delivering his resignation to Congress, Washington immediately rides to his home, Mount Vernon, where he arrives on Christmas Eve, incredibly thankful for this winter to be one of peace. 7 years ago today, Washington was preparing his men to cross the icy Delaware to risk their lives in pursuit of the distant dream of an independent America. And today, that dream is realized. I can't think of a more fitting place to leave this episode, so that's all for today. 1783 has been a year of hard-fought victory. Though our story is of course far from over, with the Revolutionary War officially in our rear view, our show will now take on a more focused structure, highlighting 2 main stories for each year with tangents about notable people and events, though much of the style will remain the same. I hope this has been a very comprehensive retelling of the Revolution, and more so, I hope that it has inspired you to look up even more information about our founding and our fight for independence. Share your favorite parts, the things you learned, and anything else you want to say by sending us a message on X or emailing 250yearsofusa@gmail.com. Let's keep the conversation going. I became so much more of a patriot by simply learning more about our history, and I can't wait to keep the story going. If you do nothing else, please share the show with a couple people you think may like it. Podcasts usually take years to grow organically and build a listenership, and this podcast event has an expiration of July 4th, 2026, and I simply don't have the resources to advertise it. So it's super important to get the word out, and I would absolutely appreciate your help in doing that. Tell whoever you can so that if there's any chance this show sparks a greater love for America and fosters deeper patriotism, we're able to all stand proud on our 250th anniversary and really appreciate just how lucky we are to be part of the history of the greatest country in the world. If I get to the point where enough people are listening, I plan on doing a weekly live stream so we can have a discussion about the nitty-gritty details and I can speak less formally about my thoughts on some of the topics we have been covering, and you can be part of the conversation there as well. Until then, follow us on X to stay in the know and make sure you subscribe on whatever platform you're listening on to catch the next episode. Next, we'll cover 1784. And discuss this new nation's economy and chronicle some early debates about the path forward. This has been Our Story, 250 years of the United States of America. And as always, thanks for listening.